WCBS-FM New York. Good morning and welcome to another edition of Dialogue 101, a Sunday morning public affairs presentation of CBS-FM. Some 19,000 buildings, hundreds of individual landmarks, and entire districts are protected by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Our guest this half hour is Anthony Robbins, who is Director of Special Projects for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Nice to have you with us this morning.
No, delighted to be here.
Before we talk about various aspects of New York, past and present, and the future, of course, because it all is related, we'll talk about the commission. When was it formed?
1965. The commission had been aborting a few years before that, but the law was passed, and that's when the commission officially came into existence. So we've been around 28 years, which makes us young for a city agency.
Let's, before we talk about the commission and what it's done, talk about what would have happened to New York without the commission.
Oh, well, let your imagination run wild. The best way, I think, to get an idea of that is look at some of the pictures of things that actually disappeared before the commission came into being. There's a wonderful book, Nathan Silver's Lost New York, and you flip through the pages and you just, it's hard to believe. I think we all know the ones that came down more recently, well, relatively speaking recently. Penn Station, which may have been the grandest civic monument the city ever saw, and it was put up in the early part of the century, lasted about 50 years, gone forever. The Singer Tower, which was once the tallest building in the world, and now it's the tallest building in the world ever demolished. You know, all kinds of things gone. Presumably without the Landmarks Commission, many of the things that we think of as forming the identity of the city, the visual identity, the things that help us when we look around and say, hey, I'm in New York, might not be here anymore.
I was even going to mention at the top of the program how wonderful it is to look at New York and look at the giant skyscrapers. But every once in a while, we will see a picture, a movie or still pictures, even a commercial recently, featured New York at the turn of the century and before, and how great it would be to just be a part of that again for a while. Well, and how much we have lost and how much this city has changed.
Well, we've lost a lot, we've gained a lot, we've kept a lot. I mean, I think all three things are true. I don't think you can overemphasize the number of landmarks in the city. I mean, it is a lot of buildings, 19,000, it's a large number, but this is about 2% of all the buildings in the city, and I don't expect, and I don't think anybody does, that the number of landmarks will, grow to anything approaching 50, 75. I'd be surprised if it ever hit 10. Nevertheless, there are parts of the city where you can wander and find yourself in environments that were created 50, 100 years ago, and get a sense of what it may have been like then. But I also think it's important not to think of landmarks as sort of a relic of the past. These are the things we live with today. They help create the environment in which we live today. Often a very attractive, pleasant, good environment, a humane environment, one that we like to be in. And if we're not lucky enough to live or work in an historic district, we may find that that's where we end up walking when we have time off.
Essentially, the historic districts are really communities the way they should be and the way they were, and perhaps the sense of community that we have lost today in New York.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the same impulse for historic districts, when it comes from communities who come banging down the door saying, please designate us, that has a lot to do with a sense of stability in a community and a sense of the identity of a community. And they do come banging down the doors. I can't think of any other instance of citizens and homeowners banding together and demanding that a city agency regulate them. But this happens all the time with landmarks. And you should probably ask them, rather than me, as a representative of the agency in question, why they do it. But certainly we often hear about stability, some sense of, some feeling that the neighborhood is not going to, be pulled out from under them, I guess is one way of saying it.
What really constitutes a landmark?
Well, legally, a landmark is any site that's been designated a landmark by the commission. The definition in the law is pretty broad. It speaks of sites that have historic or cultural or aesthetic significance in the in the city's history. The only hard and fast requirement is that they have to be 30 years old in whole or in part. We have four kinds of landmarks. They're individual landmarks. The Empire State Building. These are individual buildings. There are about, is it 700, 800? I've forgotten the numbers, that are designated by themselves for what they are as individual buildings. There are interiors. They're very few of those comparatively because they have to be publicly accessible. They tend to be things like the lobbies of office buildings, like the Chrysler Building lobby, or publicly owned public spaces. A restaurant, a theater could be one. Then we have historic districts, which by far cover the largest number of buildings just by their nature, and there are 61 of those. And those are indeed usually also in neighborhoods. They're not coterminous with neighborhoods. We don't go out and say, where's the neighborhood? This is what we designate. We go after the historic core, the historic fabric, whatever seems to make sense in that regard.
Progress is important. What about the balance, though, between preservation and growth? How tough is it to maintain that balance?
Well, I think preservation is progress. But no one in preservation would say growth is bad or that that's what we're about is stopping development. That's not what we're about at all. We're about protecting things that need to be protected and regulating them, because that's what agencies do, to see that what's good, what's special, what's of value doesn't get lost in the scramble. It's very interesting that, in this recession that we're in, building around the city is down, according to the number of permits or applications for permits filed at the buildings department. And yet in the historic districts, it's held steady. These are the areas that are attracting activity in the building world, including development. These are the areas that people want to be in. And in a sense, that's why people want to build there, too. I mean, we have to be very careful not to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. But certainly there's room for both in any city.
Is there also a lot of room for compromise as well, where growth, new building can live side by side with what should be preserved?
Well, in the sense that we've designated 2% of the city, I think that's a pretty big compromise, if you want to call that a compromise. 98% of the city is up for grabs. In the 2% that we're concerned with, our job is really to make sure that what goes on fits with what's already there and doesn't destroy the value that's already there. There's plenty of change, plenty of construction in historic districts. We issue thousands of permits for work every year. People will come and apply for work, and then the work goes forward if it's appropriate. Our task is to make sure that what goes on doesn't wreck the value that has already been seen to be there and that's been protected by the designation.
Before I ask my next question, if you could just briefly tell us about the makeup of the commission, the people who serve, their professional backgrounds, your professional background.
Well, there are really two parts to the commission. They're the commissioners themselves. They're appointed by the mayor. They serve without pay, with the exception of the chair, who also runs the day-to-day operations of the agency. By law, they have to include 3 architects, at least 1 historian, a realtor, and either a planner or a landscape architect. And also, there has to be at least 1 commissioner from each of the 5 boroughs. The staff, on the other hand, is paid. We're civil servants, come in every day, and before the budget cuts, I think we were almost 85. Now we're down into somewhere in the mid-50s, I think. And the staff tend to be either people with a deep knowledge of history or have more of a conservation background, depending on the kind of work that they're doing at the commission.
The question I was going to ask has to do with the architects who serve and their importance. It's kind of a back to the future question. How important is preservation to architecture today? What young people are learning about architecture? In other words, understanding the value of what has been and to what we're doing now.
Oh, well, I hope it's of some value. It's important to remember that, the context of this, really with the modernist movement in the 30s, there was a feeling in the architectural world that it was time to cut the ropes, get rid of all that stuff from the past, and just go out and build new modern things. And in fact, I think the various architecture schools stopped teaching architectural history, and it was an ideological kind of a thing. We don't want that. And the change happened 20, 30 years ago. I don't know. People began to say, now, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't so smart. And there's certainly a correlation, I think, chronologically, between the growth of the preservation movement in this country on the one hand, and a revival of the study of architectural history on the other hand, and changes in the way architects draw their drawings. They're certainly connected. How they influence each other, I'm not really prepared to say.
Bigger and higher is not always better, necessarily, in everyone's eyes.
Bigger and higher. I love the Empire State Building,
but we also hear talk of building a mile-high skyscraper someday.
Well, this is a fashion. I mean, the lust for building the world's tallest building goes back. If you think back, it makes sense. Until the late 19th century, the tallest buildings anywhere were religious buildings. They were the spires and domes. And it was only with the development of skyscraper technology, the steel frame, the elevator, that it became possible for commercial buildings to go higher and higher. And when they suddenly started going higher than the churches around them and cathedral spires, they were touted as the world's tallest building. There was this big boom in that in the 20s, and it's sort of gone on ever since. Right now it's the Sears Tower. Donald Trump a few years ago was talking about 150 stories. Back in the mid-19th century, though, the promoter of cast iron technology, James Bogardus, wrote that if you just had enough iron, there was no reason why you couldn't go several miles high. The question is, why would anyone want to?
I guess you could also say if you're sitting in an office a mile high, you kind of lose sight of what is down on the ground.
Well, there are all kinds of things you can say about that.
In more ways than one.
Let me add, though, that a lot of the landmarks that we've designated are skyscrapers. I mean, skyscrapers are a very important part of what the image of the city is all about. I can't imagine New York without skyscrapers. I can't imagine New York without the Empire State Building. I can't imagine it, frankly, now, although I wouldn't have said so 20 years ago, without the World Trade Center. That's very much our image, certainly our image around the world.
That's what I meant by compromise before. We can live side by side.
Well, we have to.
Talk about some of you mentioned the Empire State Building, of course, City Hall, some of the landmarks that we really know about as New Yorkers. Talk about some of the ones that we don't know about. It was an eye-opener picking up the book that your office provided.
Oh, well, I'm glad you said that. It's a wonderful book.
And we'll talk about the book a little bit later and how people might be able to take advantage of it.
Oh, and
there is so much, though,
so
much that you wouldn't imagine in New York.
Well, New York is an enormous city, and it has an enormous history. You know, the skyscrapers are well known. Less well known are the designated model tenements. One of our most recent historic districts is Jackson Heights in Queens, which was a planned garden community. It really... The developers looked at the way tenement buildings and apartment buildings were built in New York. You put up a building on a plot of land, take up almost all of it, leave a little dark alley in the back, and thought, well, that's not really the best way to go. Why don't we use less of the land for the building, open up the middle of the block, and instead of having little lots, have large, lush gardens? And they did, and the neighborhood is Jackson Heights, and it was famous around the world. That's an historic district. There are 3 rides in Coney Island that are designated as landmarks: the Cyclone, the Wonder Wheel, and the Parachute Jump. There are 2 trees that are landmarks: one in Queens, one in Brooklyn. There are, let's see, the cast iron street clocks. There are bridges. A lot of the physical infrastructure that makes the city possible, like the East River bridges, but also like pieces of the Croton reservoir system, which brought and bring spring country water to the big city, or the viaduct of the IRT, where the number 1 and 9 train cross 125th Street, an engineering landmark. So there's all kinds of things.
Educationally, as far as what the city has and has been able to preserve, how important is that, especially to the young people of the city? Well, not just learning about it from a book, but being able to see it, perhaps?
Well, I think it's very important. I think the Commission thinks it's very important.
And are we taking advantage of it, I guess, is another way of asking it.
Well, I think that there's been a movement in the schools to bring local history to kids in a more a better way, or make more of an effort to do that. I went to school when I was a kid where, I guess it was because some of the teachers thought this was important. We learned the local landmarks. We went down to see the Van Cortlandt Mansion. I grew up in the Bronx. We went to see the Dyckman House in Upper Manhattan. Now, that's a very sort of old-fashioned approach to what's an historic building. It's something colonial. But the idea was right. We don't live in a vacuum. We didn't just sort of arrive on the planet yesterday. There is a history. There is an environment. It does shape us, and it's important to know about it. When I take my own kids around the city, I show them everything I can. They then turn to me and say, "Dad, that's really boring." But if their teachers do it, I'm a father
too. I understand.
But if their teachers do it, maybe it makes a difference. Something
that should be done constantly, really.
Yeah, well, it should just be part of growing up. It's sort of understanding where you live and where you come from. America's a very unusual place. We all, almost all of us come from someplace else. We all have family stories, and our cities are the story of really something growing out of nothing. And not to know that is to be diminished.
And someday they're going to be adults who may be looking back and thinking about preserving what they've had.
I sure hope so.
Which is important. Tourism, also very important as far as revenue making for the city. Again, we have the famous landmarks, which I'm sure a lot of people visit, and that's important. Again, balancing, though, between the revenues from tourism and preserving what has been preserved, avoiding the crowds and so forth.
I'm not sure I follow.
Is it possible to promote landmarks in the city, historic landmarks, without having them overrun, I guess?
Oh, well, that this issue of tourism and the overrunning of places is a very big issue, really, in countries all around the world, especially in places of small places. I can't somehow the image of New York being overrun by anything other than New Yorkers is one that's hard to imagine. Tourism is a major, maybe the major industry in the city, and I'm quite sure that a lot of the things that people come to see, whether they know it or not, or think of it that way or not, are in fact landmarks, from the Broadway theaters to the Empire State Building to Greenwich Village. If they manage to find their way outside of the confines of Manhattan Island, there are landmarks and other wonderful things in the outer boroughs. But personally, I've never thought that that was the real reason to do it. I think of this as something that's for us. It's for our lives, which we live here, for understanding who we are and what our civic identity is, and knowing where we are.
You mentioned budget cuts before, and no matter what subject we discuss, budget always comes into it, and funding. Where does most of the funding, everything costs money, obviously. Where does most of the funding come from, and are you worried?
Am I worried? Most of our funding comes from the city budget. A portion of it comes from federal funds called CD, or Community Development Block Grant Funds. And we have suffered cuts. As I say, our office staff declined from somewhere in the mid-80s to somewhere in the mid-50s. Will it happen again? I sure hope not. We're really tiny. When you compare the Landmarks Commission to the city government as a whole, we're not even a drop in the bucket. We're a piece of a drop in the bucket. There are, I don't know, what is it, 250,000 employees in the city of New York, 50. They could, you could wipe out the agency, and I don't think it would make any difference in the red ink that the city's facing. But for an agency that's so small, we're very visible, and we do have an impact on people's lives. I think a positive impact, and I think it would be short-sighted to make any further cuts in our agency. But I can't speak for the agency or the administration on this matter. This is my personal feeling. I would hate to see it happen. It's very hard for us.
Is it a tough message to get across?
What's that?
The understanding of the need for what is being done.
I think more and more the landmarks preservation is understood, accepted, and approved of, and liked by lots of people. There will always be lots of people who don't think it's a good idea. Again, we are besieged with communities that would like to see themselves designated. It's not that we go out and impose ourselves on neighborhoods that don't want us. I think in every case, the historic districts that have been designated have been, and then upheld, of course, by formerly the Board of Estimate and now the City Council, have been with the approval and desires, really, of the communities.
Let me ask you about preservation. Before the wrecker's ball, perhaps, at the last moment when it's too late, the process, how it works. Do you fear for buildings or locations that could be set for demolition where the word comes too late of their significance?
Well, when it comes too late, it comes too late. If the buildings department has issued a demolition permit, that's that. We can't undo that. The Landmarks Commission can't do everything at once, any more than anybody else can. We've been around 28 years, and we've done a fair amount. But everything is done on a case-by-case basis, after a good deal of deliberation, hard research, a lot of thought, public hearings, and that's how it should be. And unfortunately, the City of New York is not going to stand still and wait for us. And we have lost things that should not have been lost, in my opinion. Well, that's life. What can I say?
But more or less, the system is in place, the safeguards in place, as the permits are sought and the hearings and so forth, where a particular building, perhaps a location, can be identified.
Well, we've been successful in identifying and designating buildings over the years, so I guess the answer to that is sure.
What have you lost?
What have we lost? Without naming names, there have been one or two instances where we've calendared public hearings on buildings only to see them disappear mysteriously, over the weekend. That's really very rare. I would look back more to the very early years of the commission, when we were just starting and not really yet in gear to save the Metropolitan Opera, the Singer Tower, which I mentioned before, which is not only the tallest building in the world when it was built, but one of the most beautiful office buildings New York has ever seen. I think anybody could sit down and write a list of favorite buildings that didn't make it. And again, I would refer anybody who's interested to Nathan Silver's book on Lost New York. It's just page after page of stuff, and you think, wow, I want to go out and see that. And of course, you can't.
You mentioned the Penn Station renovation that's going on now. Earlier in the program, what Penn Station was at one time and what it's becoming now. Like thousands of other commuters, I've had the chance of seeing the work in progress and seeing part of the original Penn Station as the demolition is taking place and the changes are taking place. Is that one example now of progress?
Well, if you, do you mean the proposal to turn the post office into the new?
No, the actual the Penn Station now.
Oh, I haven't been underneath.
If there's,
I haven't seen that.
You get to see some of the original, the columns and so forth.
Oh, well,
and I understand efforts are being made to preserve part of that, so it can be seen what it was like.
I wasn't aware of that. That's terrific if it's true. It's always been possible to see some of the stuff underground because that didn't get entirely demolished. It's when you see the pictures of what was over the ground, and particularly when you see the pictures of the enormous carved panels sort of being carted off and dumped in the meadows in New Jersey. You know, basically, we threw that building out. I mean, that's what happened. And of course, now why I asked my question. Now who is it? I guess it's Penn Central, Amtrak, whoever it is saying, look, we made a terrible mistake, but we could undo it if we could just move into the post office across the street, which is built by the same architects, has that same grandeur. Wouldn't it be great if we could be in there? And I guess for the people who were parading around with the signs protesting the demolition 25, 30 years ago, there must be some grim sense of satisfaction. You know, finally they woke up, they being just sort of us, really, the world. Of course, it's too late for Penn Station. Let's hope it's not too late for other things.
You mentioned the word underground a moment ago. Do we have anything underground that is preserved with landmark status? Parts of the subway system, perhaps? Yes,
there are a number of the stations on the IRT, the very earliest stations, and there is the African Burial Ground, which is now actually part of an historic district called the African Burial Ground and the Commons Historic District, a long name, but it refers to the burying ground both north of Chambers Street and the City Hall Park, which is really called the Commons. And of course, what's significant there are the various things at ground level, but also the knowledge that that was a colonial era African burying ground. And it's interesting, that's the one you can't see in the sense that a lot of it's underground. And yet, I think of all the things that we've designated in the last couple of years, well, really in my time at the Commission, which is almost 15 years, that got the most emotional response, that got the most interest, that touched a chord, touched a nerve, really. It was really remarkable to watch. It's still touching the nerve. It's not
certainly
finished.
Heard a lot about it.
That's right.
Opened a lot of minds, I think, as well.
Yes, in many ways.
Maybe this is one of the alligator in the sewer myths, but I constantly hear stories about underground subway stations that have been sealed off, but they're in their original condition.
Well,
is this a myth I'm hearing that's going around, or
no, not at all. One of them you can't see and is in. Well, when I was last there, was in very good condition, which is the City Hall station on the IRT. If you ever get off the 6 at the end of the line downtown, you get off at Brooklyn Bridge Station, and then the train sort of disappears, and somehow it comes back on the other side. Where it's been has been making a loop under City Hall Park through the now closed-off City Hall station. There are other stations that are closed off that you can see. On the IRT, there's a 91st Street station. If you look carefully, you'll see it, and it's only in its original condition if you think the graffiti is 80 years old. And there are a couple of those on both the east and the west side. But the great one is the City Hall station.
Is there one in Brooklyn that has been sealed off, but I think it's opened every once in a while for private tours?
Well, now you must be thinking
intriguing.
About the pneumatic tube. I think that's what it was under Atlantic Avenue. That's not part of what we consider the subway. It was a very early experimental train, and there was a tunnel there, and it was discovered I don't know 8 or 10 years ago. But it's separate from the subway system.
But there is so much that we don't know about, the general public doesn't know about.
Well, New York is like that. I mean, in Rome, they like to say that every time they dig for something, they run into a Roman ruin. Well, in New York, every time you turn around, you find something that you just didn't know was there, and that no one knew was there, and you marvel at it.
Compared to other cities, how are we doing as far as preserving our past?
Well, I wouldn't want to draw comparisons. I mean, I think that New York does a very good job of it. We have a good commission. There's a lot of public support for it. I've been in other parts of the country that have cities that don't have strong landmarks laws, and it shows. And I've been in other parts of the world which don't have strong landmarks laws, and it shows also. It's very interesting. I remember talking to somebody from England, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, and saying, why don't you come visit us in New York? And she said, yes, New York, that's interesting. You know, New York is becoming an historic city, isn't it? I mean, we've always been an historic city. We're an old city. We go back 3.5 centuries. But what she meant was that people are beginning to understand that New York is an old city. I mean, that's part of... You know, New York has always thought of itself as a new city. It's part of being the new world megalopolis. Everything here is new up to the minute, and what was here yesterday doesn't matter. And that's changed. I think that's very clear. When I came back to New York from graduate school, again 15, 20 years ago, and looked for guidebooks to New York and books about New York in the New York bookstores, there just weren't any. There were one or two, but they were very hard to find. And the things that had been published were all from the late 19th century. Now you walk into any bookstore in New York, and it's not just one shelf; it's dozens of shelves and 100 titles, and I think that all by itself is a good indication of how our understanding of the city and our interest in the city has changed.
Speaking of books, the book I mentioned earlier on, is it available?
It certainly is at any bookstore. The book is about New York City landmarks. It was based on landmark reports. It is published by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It is a very modest $6.95 and worth every penny and more. And what it does is list all the landmarks in the city, give you a brief paragraph or so on what it is, why it's a landmark, what's interesting about it. There are maps, there are charts, and photographs. And for a handy pocket guide to the city's marvels, you can't do better.
If I ask you back in a year, which we will this book be twice the size? Do you hope?
Well, there are already more landmarks than were in the book. We do keep designating, and I hope we will continue to.
I thank you very much for taking time out to be with us this morning. Please come back in the future.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Our guest this morning, Anthony Robbins, Director of Special Projects for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Have a nice Sunday. I'm Al Meredith, CBS-FM.